There's a crater lake in Africa called Lake Nyos. Year-round, this lake, like many others, is stratified, meaning it has a warm upper layer and a cool lower layer which don't mix. But Nyos is unique, that it sits on top of a pool of magma, and CO2 slowly seeps into the water from below. Thus, the cold bottom layer gets saturated with CO2 over time, while the warm top layer stays without abnormal CO2 levels. In 1986, something, maybe a landslide, triggered the lake to overturn, meaning the heavily carbonated lower layer suddenly flipped to the top all at once. This caused the CO2 saturated water to suddenly have somewhere to go, akin to shaking a soda can before opening it. It caused a giant wave to come out, together with hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2. Because CO2 is heavier than air, this CO2 cloud rushed down the slope of the mountain to the nearby villages, asphyxiating and killing nearly all people and animals in a 25-kilometer area around the lake. Something about this natural disaster just puts me in awe. It's completely unpredictable, invisible, and leaves no traces of damage. Just dead bodies everywhere. Imagine experiencing this before science could explain how this happened. It's like the 10th plague of Egypt. I had to come up with a similar natural disaster for my world. Interestingly, I already did come up with a similar natural disaster a while ago. The small background needed for this natural disaster is that on my planet, there are volcanic-like mountains that stand tall in the sky, looking like giant nuclear plant cooling towers that constantly spew out some type of smoke into the sky. This wouldn't actually be a volcanic source, it would just look like one. Think alien planet/parallel universe volcano. This smoke isn't water or common Earth gases. Rather, it's a bunch of unique molecules and structures from this planet that create novel weather patterns and precipitation styles all across the planet. The contents of this spewage changes over time, and sometimes, very, very, very rarely, on the scale of thousands and tens of thousands of years. The spewage releases toxic molecules that just asphyxiates and or poisons everything in sight. But this natural smokestack formation is something I have many, many, many more thoughts on, and if it sounds interesting, I'm planning on making a video about it eventually. But I'm not here to talk about that today. The Lake Nyos disaster was fresh in my head, and I really wanted to make a new, unique natural disaster. I couldn't really think of anything until I saw the prompt illusion/lock on the Pastel Gnome Discord server. It made me start thinking in the direction of a natural disaster that is also somehow an illusion, and one that hurts you by quote-unquote locking you. Here's what I came up with. In my world, besides for those smokestack formations that I mentioned earlier, there are many underground pools or lakes of various chemical cocktails. They are naturally forming and actually have to do with the smokestack cones that I mentioned, and these pools aren't necessarily water-based. There are many other chemicals that are liquid at everyday temperatures. And they all have different properties that the people of the planet sometimes use for their advantages. So based on this background, my Lake Nyos idea was as follows. What if there's a mountain crater lake above one of these pools, and this pool slowly releases some chemical, let's call it fomogen, that seeps into the lake and then turns into foam once it mixes with the water. The lake is stratified just like Nyos, and so the layers don't mix, so the foam builds up under all that water and it stays on the bottom. And there are many of such lakes scattered through the landscape. It's not just one lake in the whole world. Then, maybe once a year, or once in a couple years, the temperature or atmospheric content, or river content, or something, changes just so that the lake layers are able to mix slightly more than usual, causing the teensiest bit of foam to finally be able to make it to the surface. But the foam is dense, and it climbs up slowly. When the foam reaches the air, it pops. And here's the part where I call these lakes Siren lakes. The noise the pop makes sounds just like a human screaming. Like if you've ever heard goats screaming, they sound just like people. It's uncanny. So anyone who lives nearby and doesn't know about this regularly occurring phenomenon, rush over to help the drowning person. But once they get too close and touch the foam, they start getting stuck. The foam is super sticky and heavy, and it starts building up more and more the more they struggle. At first, their swimming slows down as the force they have to exert to move their arms and legs increases, but as they struggle, they get even more foam on themselves, and it clings tighter and tighter, until they're dragged down like quicksand and drown. So the popping, mimicking the sound of a person drowning, is the illusion, and the fact that it locks you into drowning once you get too close is unsurprisingly the lock. But that's not all. Most of these siren lakes are just that. But some lakes happen to have the right set of qualities that allow them to go a couple steps further. When the foam is open to the atmosphere, it dries out pretty quickly and hardens, forming a kind of cement. Thus, every pop creates a bunch of cement particles and pieces that fall back down to the bottom of the lake. Over time, this creates a hard lake bed that makes it harder and harder for the fomagen to leak into the lake from the underground pool that creates the foam in the first place. Once the fomagen is completely blocked from seeping into the lake, this causes pressure to start building up as more fomagen gets released up but gets stuck under the lake. In most of the Siren lakes, the pressure never builds up too much, because there's always room for it to rise into the lake. But in some of the Siren lakes, the bottom really does fully get covered with layers of cement, and eventually, maybe once or twice a century, this pressure is enough to burst up the layers of cement. This pushes a lot of the pre-existing foam up the water column, while simultaneously creating a lot of new foam at once, causing the water to expand even more while it's already rising up from the bursting in the first place. If you're standing nearby the lake at that moment, you'll suddenly hear a lot of screeching and screaming as the foam reaches the surface of the water and pop, accompanying a big wave that will splash out and create a little flood down the mountain. A bunch of foam will spill out and leave a layer of cement around the lake, following the trail of the floodwater. If the flood hits a farm, the crops will be covered with cement. Any gutters or wells will be filled in. The bottoms of doors will be cemented shut. Since the foam is super sticky, getting any on your skin will be disastrous. You can't easily remove all of it when it's still foam, and as soon as it dries out, it sticks so tightly to your skin that removing it requires removing some flesh too. Now, this disaster happens commonly enough in the lakes that do have these disasters, that cities would be prepared for them. They'd build everything on platforms, and their wells would have higher walls. Since much of the ground was already covered in cement from ages past, they probably don't even have extensive farms. They also might have walls, or moats and paddles to redirect such an eruption away from the city, and they would try to paddle away the foam so it doesn't fill up the moat or build a siege ramp by the walls. The biggest disasters happen to cities next to Siren lakes that don't usually have such an eruption until all of a sudden they do. They wouldn't have any moats or raised houses. They would have actual soil with farms that would be unprotected and get flooded. I hope you thought that those eruptions sounded absolutely terrible to live through, because it gets worse. What caused the disaster at Lake Nyos was the overturning of the lake. All the CO2 got released at once. The foam eruptions I just described isn't caused by the release of all the foam. Most of the foam still stays on the bottom of the lake. However, picture this lake overturning suddenly. Maybe there's a large sudden spike or dip in temperature, or a major landslide, or a major earthquake, something to really disrupt the layers. Maybe it's a particularly large bursting up of fomagen, maybe one caused by a large earthquake that shook up the underground pool. It could be any one of these, or a combination of several different factors. The point is, it's a much, much rarer event, maybe once in 1,000 years. All the foam comes up to the top, and it bursts out of the water in a giant pop, along with a huge wave. There's so much foam that as it comes out, large amounts separate and start rolling down the banks of the lake in giant balls the size of houses. The walls and moats that surround the cities that are used to getting the small versions of these eruptions are not prepared for this massive volume of foam. The foam just goes directly over it, as if it wasn't even there. Or if the city has moats, it just overwhelms their capacity to handle it. And then if anyone gets caught in the foam, they're dead. If they get fully covered, they'll die from suffocation or subsequent live cementation. If they manage to stay unsuffocated, they'll probably wish they did suffocate, as removing the cement will cause serious flesh ripping and open wounds, which will lead to a much slower and painful death. And if you think you're smart and you hide in a house, that's not much better. As the foam passes over the whole house, you'll just become entombed in it, as every window and door gets cemented shut. You're just left to slowly asphyxiate as the oxygen runs out. If you notice this happening to your neighbors and think you're better off climbing a tower, well, you won't run out of oxygen, but good luck leaving the building without jumping off a few stories to your death. The only escape is to run away faster than a rushing wave of water. Needless to say, there are not many survivors of this natural disaster. So you'll have these cities that think that they're so prepared for these foam floods, only to find out every once in 1,000 years or longer that they are completely unprepared for the worst of it. And they're so full of themselves because they see how other cities that aren't prepared for them just die. They think that it'll never be them, and then suddenly a massive flood happens, and then even they are wiped out. And it's a major history-changing event that can wipe out powerful cities that think they're all that. So there's the illusion of the screaming, and then there's the part where you're locked into the building until you suffocate. The plants that would evolve in these regions that have the foam eruptions would grow really quickly so that they're high enough to not get covered by the next foam flood, and the seeds would be able to grow in cement, like those weeds that grow in the cracks in pavement. However, not much plants would grow there. Instead, there would be a ton of fungus everywhere, since they can digest rock. And since there isn't much plant life in this environment, but the climate is good enough to support growth, there would be large mushroom forests rather than tree forests. And these forests would be able to support animal ecosystems too. In fact, this is probably the perfect place for the rocks with lichen-made waterholes, which I've already made a video on. In short, they're a three-way symbiosis between lichen, frogs, and algae in their self-made homes in rocks. But maybe I should change that. Rather than it being in rocks, it would be in the ground that is made of layers and layers of cement. But there would have to be a few changes to that, since now, if I'm saying that there's whole mushroom forests, it's not that the rocks lack nutrients, but rather there would be a different reason for that whole symbiosis to start in the first place. But it could still work. If that sounds interesting, by the way, check it out right after this video. It's one of my first. There's so much more to world build about in this biome that I just happened to create in the process of coming up with this new natural disaster, but that will have to be for another time. So, one more thing before I go. Since this mega eruption happens rarely, and there are few survivors, if any, people don't really know to be prepared for it. They don't know that this happens. But I can imagine word of mouth of survivors making its way into some obscure book on interesting facts about the land by some forgotten scholar lost in the back of some library. And then one day a man finds this book and learns that this disaster is possible. And maybe he's at war, or he's bitter at someone. So he uses this knowledge and causes a landslide to activate the total overturning of the lake to release the foam on a city or maybe an oncoming enemy army. That's pretty much it for this time. If you enjoyed this natural disaster and some ecology building that just happened to come with it because of the way that it works, you might enjoy some of my other world building juice too, like the rocks with lichen-made waterholes. And of course, JUICE stands for Journeys to Unveil Imaginative Creative Environments.